Hello friends, I am Dr. Sonam Singh, working as an assistant professor in Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. So today we are going to talk about module 20, which is divided into two parts. So let's begin with part A, which is on the title, Theories of Normative and Applied Ethics, Western Perspective. In 1687, Isaac Newton proposed his most renowned theory, which comprised of three laws of motion which governs our environment. It is worthy of contemplation whether human life can merely be governed by scientific natural laws. Society merely founded on scientific laws is definitely up for a collapse, since human beings would not have any control over their actions. There would be no legitimate grounds for judgment in case of moral conflict, which will ultimately lead to a claustrophobic situation. Thus, along with scientific or natural laws, human life ought to be also governed by moral laws or ethical principles. Today, ethics or morality has seamlessly integrated into human life and has also developed as a prolific branch of philosophy. The term ethic is originally derived from Greek word ethos, which means custom or character. Ethics basically situates human being in the domain of a moral agent, wherein each action performed by the agent is either right or wrong, good or bad, in accordance to a moral standard. It also specifies the moral standard and analyzes values and provides a justification for them. Now let's see the history of ethics. In the domain of philosophy, the origin of ethics can be traced to the Greeks. Socrates introduced a quest for rationalizing ethical judgments. Plato's theory of forms can be seen as the first attempt at defending moral realism and offering an objective ground for moral truths. Although in Socrates and Plato's work, ethical implications were implicit, the first Greek philosopher to explicitly construct a foundation in ethics was Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. The medieval era was glorified by the philosophical contributions of Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. At this time, church was superior, as a result of which philosophy was only conceived in sync with religion. For Augustine, ethics was an amalgamation of leading a good life which would facilitate one in attaining salvation. On the other hand, Thomas Aquinas blended the concept of naturalism propounded by Aristotle along with Augustine's notion of religion. This era culminated with the rise of modernity. The modern age was a product of various revolutions in all fields of life. It encompassed a new mode of thought, mainly in politics, science, culture, and the secondary sector. The state, which was now governed by novel modern principle, also contributed in reforming ethical thought and way of life. René Descartes, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, etc. were some of the remarkable contributors of ethics in the modern era. The modern era was succeeded by the contemporary era in ethics, whose origin was marked by Principia Ethica, written by G.E. Moore. Now let's see the methods devised in ethics. Ethics being a species of philosophy, which is generally referred as the genus by Russ Schaeffer Landon, implements methods which are analogous to those of philosophical inquiry. Ethical inquiry comprises of inductive and deductive method. Although in ethics, the inductive method, that is particular to universal, is generally preferred to the deductive, which is universal to particular. Now let's move on to the objectives of the module. This module will primarily deal with the way various ethical theories are situated within ethics and how it tends to devise methods for moral theories. In order to trace different positions, this module has been divided into three sections, which covers the three broad positions in ethical theory and thinkers within them advocating it. The historical development of the ethical theories could best be understood by looking into the three different positions within ethics, which helps one in being aware of the major issues of this discourse, which is primarily limited to the Western perspective. It is beyond the scope of this module to discuss every aspect of the concerned issue. However, an attempt will be made to make it as inclusive as possible. Now let's proceed further to see the ethical approaches. The scope of ethics cannot be limited to merely one way of ethical inquiry. The branch of ethics can be bifurcated into 4 further branches, namely normative ethics, prescriptive ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. Now let's first start with normative ethics. It prescribes a set of norms in accordance with a moral standard which every moral agent ought to adhere to. It judges the rightness or wrongness of an action on the basis of the prescribed moral standard. As a result of this is often referred as prescriptive ethics. It also is guided by moral injunction ought, as the norms are universally applicable to all moral agents. It basically specifies what a moral agent ought to do in a particular moral situation. Now let's move on to descriptive ethics. It comprises of the actual state of affairs. It is a description of what people actually grant as the standard for determining right or wrong in a society. Descriptive ethics is often termed as comparative in nature since it attempts to draw a comparison between ethics across various human societies. Now, when we talk about applied ethics, it is fundamentally an amalgamation of normative ethics and descriptive ethics. It essentially examines whether the norms prescribed by normative ethicists can actually be implemented universally in all real life situations. Its main focus is whether all ethical dilemmas can be resolved by executing the theoretical maxims and ethical concepts. Applied ethicists basically strive to examine the connection between is and ought. They try to analyze whether what is the case actually corresponds to what ought to be the case. Applied ethics comprises of various major fields of inquiry such as environmental ethics, bioethics, business ethics, media ethics, etc. The most pertinent issues in the field of applied ethics is abortion, organ transplantation, euthanasia, capital punishment, suicide, animal ethics, land ethics, etc. Now, the last component is meta-ethics. It is a domain of ethics which, unlike normative ethics, does not determine whether an action is good or bad, but attempts to decipher the structure and essence of ethical concepts such as good in itself. It is basically an inquiry into the nature of moral statement. According to the naturalists and the non-naturalist, moral statements are subject to truth and falsity. However, emotivists such as A.J. Iyer do not endorse the same view. They believe that moral statements only have an emotive relevance and thus cannot be subjected to any kind of truth or falsity. It is this tussle between various ethicists regarding the nature of morality which comprises the domain of ethics. Now let's proceed further to talk about pillars of normative ethics. Generally speaking, normative ethics involves specific position concerning how to act, what ought and ought not to be done, what is right and wrong, and so on. For instance, is it morally wrong to kill someone? Normative ethics attempts to provide universal guideline governing human actions by regulating the content of our actions. As discussed, normative ethics deals with how we ought to act and live by providing procedures and principles guiding our actions. Normative rules interpret ought to kind of statements and assertions as contrasted with the is type statements and assertions. A common way to describe normative ethics is to describe norms as reason to believe and to feel. Normative ethics comprises of 3 pillars: deontological ethics, consequentialist ethics, and virtue ethics. When we talk about deontological ethics, it prioritizes right action over and above other criteria such as its consequences. These theories are aimed at developing an imperative which is supposed to be obligatory and facilitates in determining the permissibility or impermissibility of a moral action. For the deontologists, an action is morally justifiable if and only if it conforms to the moral standards set on the basis of rational analysis and is guided by a sense of duty as opposed to any other motive. The most prominent deontological theories are Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative and moral absolutism and the divine command theory. Now let's talk about these deontological theories. So first is Kant's categorical imperative. Kantian ethics takes the classical liberal position when it claims that man is a rational and free being and accepts the priority of right and moral laws over the concept of the good. Kant has full faith in the existence of a sense of the right in every human being, which he or she can realize only by following moral maxim. Man should always behave in a manner that humanity becomes an end and not as means. Kant claims that man is rational and free because man cannot be the subject of our categories of understanding. Kant in this work, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, has asserted that morality is concerned with freedom and that the very fact that man has a sense of obligation to follow the moral law and duty determines that he is free. Hence, Kant in Groundwork has maintained that the sense of morality inherent in man is the condition of the freedom. The doctrine of the moral law should not be confused with happiness and good. Good or happiness should not be defined as a moral law. This is because they cannot provide an objectively valid ground for the moral law. The moral principles on which our action should be based, according to Kant, is categorical imperative. Categorical imperative is that which is unconditional and universally valid. Kant has defined the categorical imperatives as one that represents an action as objectively necessary and makes it necessary not indirectly through the representation of some end that can be attained by action, but through the mere representation and this action itself, its form, and hence directly. It is categorical because it is unconditionally valid, and imperative because it is an obligation, a command which we have to obey in order to perform moral actions. It does not get affected by empirical circumstances. Hence, in a moral action, the will of a man should be determined by categorical imperative, and only in that way can a man be said to be acting according to his reason and free will. In other words, the action done from the categorical imperative is the determinant of our free will. In contrast to a hypothetical imperative, a categorical imperative can be defined as a command which is not context sensitive, independent of a person's desire, not conditioned to any ulterior motive, and universally applies to each and every rational agent. Kant further expounds the notion of categorical imperative by presenting four formulations for the same. The first formulation is the formula of the universality and nature. It states, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The second formulation states, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. The third formulation states that the third practical principle follows as the ultimate condition of their harmony with practical reason. The idea of the will of every rational living being as a universally legislating will. The fourth formulation states that act according to a maxim of a universally legislating member of a merely possible kingdom of ends. Therefore, through the lens of Kant's categorical imperative, action is said to be moral if and only if abides by the categorical imperative, that is, it treats a person only as an end in himself and never as a mean to achieve something else. Along with that, the action ought to be guided by our goodwill, which is motivated by duty. The reason why each and every moral agent should adhere to the categorical imperative is because it is a product of our pure practical reason, which we all share in common. Now, the second one is moral absolutism. Moral absolutism judges the rightness or wrongness of an action against an absolute moral standard. An absolute moral standard unbiased in nature. It cannot be altered or modified as per the prevailing conditions. For these ethical thinkers, ethical actions are intrinsically good or bad, right or wrong. For instance, when we say being honest is synonymous to being moral, it means a moral agent ought to be honest in every circumstances. His degree of honesty should not vary as per the benefit he can avail from every situation. This means that the practice of honesty as a moral norm is absolute in nature and no exceptions to this is permissible. Moral absolutism should not be confused with moral universalism. As opposed to moral relativism, universalism ensures that a moral agent is independent of any cultural domination. However, for moral absolutists, a moral action should not only be free from cultural domination, but it should also be free from any external motivation apart from goodwill by virtue of being intrinsic in nature. Now here comes the divine command theory. This theory propounds that an action is right if God has decreed it to be right. God being omniscient, His commands should be adhered to without any alterations. Thus, an action is moral if we follow the moral commandments in an unbiased manner, only as a part of our duty and not in hope of some desired result. Although the deontological theories are extremely robust in nature and also are one of the most influential ethical theories, deontological ethics is rigid in nature and is often charged for lacking context sensitivity. Although theoretically they are tremendously persuasive, but they might not be the best when it comes to practice or implementing these theories in real life situations. Thus further, we would have a look at a slightly more flexible normative theory which is more accommodative and practically accessible. Now here comes the consequentialist theory. Consequentialism is the second major type of normative theory which is broadly contrasted with the deontological theory, as the former lays emphasis on means and ways of performing an act in order to analyze its moral rightness or wrongness, whereas this theory justifies the moral rightness of an action by looking at its consequences. An action is morally acceptable if the consequences are good and unacceptable if the consequences are not good or favorable. The ethical theory of utilitarianism is the modification of the consequentialist theory that calls for maximization of goodness in society by calculating the probable outcomes of actions. The two major principles underlying the consequentialist theories are: first, that rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the result that follows from it, either for the interest of the individual or for a majority in society. And second, the hedonist principle. It argues that pleasure is the only good and pain is the only evil, and human beings are pleasure-seeking creatures. While the first result-based principle is problematic since it relies on a simple, linear, causal relationship between a moral act and its consequences, the hedonist or behaviorist theory is tautological in that the pleasurable or painful consequences, that is responses, are not independent of the ethical act that is deemed to their cause. Now, let's talk about hedonism in a bit detail. Utilitarianism has been originated from hedonism. It is close to hedonism of the Cyrenaic, who admitted the possibility of some pleasures being more desirable than others. Even though Bentham, Mill, Sidgwick moves towards a wider sense of pleasure, their theories mainly advocates that man desires those pleasures that give him long-lasting satisfaction. Moreover, hedonism as an independent theory and as a source of utilitarianism has many forms: psychological and ethical. Psychological hedonism propagates the view that pleasure is natural and normal object of desire. According to this definition, man always perform those actions which have pleasant consequences and they can only desire pleasantness. Although they hold that man doesn't necessarily desire greatest possible pleasure, which leaves a room for ethical hedonism. Now, ethical hedonism is believed to assert that pleasure is the proper object of desire. This theory of ethics is an examination into how men ought to act and what men ought to desire. This theory puts major emphasis on two factors, intensity and duration. Since it is difficult to estimate the comparative importance given to the two factors, thus it is believed that certainty, nearness in the present time, purity should be taken into consideration. There are various kinds of hedonists. When good and pleasant are taken interchangeably in the moral domain, broadly classifies the holder of such theories as an analytic hedonist. Some ethicists may not consider good to be identical to pleasant consequences, but the fundamental question, what is that makes a good action to be good, still remains unchallenged. Broad classifies such ethicists under the domain of empirical synthetic hedonists. Now let's talk about utilitarianism, as it is one of the most important ethical theory in a bit detail. Utilitarianism or consequentialism is a moral and legal theory that was propagated in the 18th and 19th century by Jeremy Bentham. This theory is based on the happiness principle or the principle of utility. According to this theory, right or good action is that which leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Thus, unlike Kant, the utilitarians believe that an action, in order to qualify as a moral act, need not be based on the motive of the agent, but merely on its desired consequences. Even though many charges have been twisted against utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, in his essay Utilitarianism, attempts to clarify this doctrine given by his father James Mill and Jeremy Bentham by a thorough analysis of the utilitarian principle. Mill defines utilitarianism as a theory based on the principle that actions are right if and only if they promote happiness and wrong if they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. He defines happiness as pleasure and absence of pain, and unhappiness as pain and privation of pleasure. Consequentialism or utilitarianism is not mere hedonism. Hedonistic theory maintains that pleasure is the sole good, whereas utilitarianism also emphasizes on utility or usefulness. On the one hand, the proponents of the consequentialist theory have put forward the moral maxim, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which emphasizes on the wide distribution of human pleasure and its maximization. On the other hand, a purely hedonist theory would not be concerned about distribution of pleasures among many or few. Utilitarianism has been an influential and widely accepted theory of ethical philosophy. Mill establishes the theory through the following arguments. He holds that the only thing that is desirable in itself is pleasure, and all other things that are desirable are just a mean to pleasure. Further, he says that since each person's pleasure is desirable to that person, so the general happiness is the good which is desirable for an aggregate of all the people. Therefore, the happiness principle is the appropriate moral standard for judging the rightness or wrongness of moral actions. For Mill, there is a qualitative distinction between pleasures. That is, some are superior to others and are preferred more by an individual. But here he undermines the basic position of utilitarianism by giving qualitative distinction of pleasure, which is inconsistent with the hedonistic principle. The theory of utilitarianism is the most important form of consequential theory. Greatest happiness for greatest number of people. This statement summarizes the central idea of utilitarianism. Bentham and J.S. Mill are the two most renowned thinkers of utilitarianism, and the key ideas of their theory is that consequences or outcomes of the action are the keys of determining whether they are ethical or not. Jeremy Bentham, in his work An Introduction to the Principles of Morals, accepts the view now known as hedonism, that pleasures or happiness is the only good and its opposite, pain or unhappiness, is intrinsically bad. The desire to increase pain and avoid pain or unhappiness not only determines how do we act, but how we ought to act. This forms the basis of the principle of utility, which he later called as the greatest happiness principle. To the question that it's whose happiness we consider, Bentham makes it clear that it's the happiness of the community, not just individuals. Community he describes is a fictitious body composed of individual members of whose sum of interest is what is of concern. Bentham considers that his principle is not susceptible of any direct proof. He gives arguments in his first chapter to prove the same. He explains this with three possible principles or types of principles on which one may act. His principle may be called gross or sensualistic, as he does not admit qualitative differences among pleasures and only talk of quantity. Whereas J.S. Mill or John Stuart Mill agrees with Bentham on the greatest happiness of the greatest number principle and that this should be the determining principle of human actions. However, in his work on liberty and utilitarianism, he disagrees with Bentham that it is only the quantity of pleasure that matters. He argued that not only quantity but the quality of pleasure should also be considered while determining the moral worth of an action. That is why the theory of Jeremy Bentham is also known as quantitative utilitarianism and Mill's theory is known as qualitative utilitarianism. Mill, also a profounder of this philosophy, inherited the works of Jeremy Bentham, under whose imperatives he developed his own views. Mill's act of improvement on Bentham's philosophy can be understood as an attempt to strengthen it against all possible criticisms and work for its propensity. Mill expounded on the works of Bentham and improvised it for better acceptability against charges by Kantians. Mill's account can be understood by summarizing these points. He advocates that pleasure is the only thing that is desirable, and the proof that it is desirable is the fact that people actually desire to do it. Each person's own happiness is part of the sum total of happiness of everyone. He talks about the idea of self-education, which brings in the idea of quality when assessing happiness. He talks about the competent judges to decide in case of selection of which happiness should be preferred, and these judges are the ones who prefer intellectual pleasure to bodily pleasure. Mill says it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He also introduces aesthetic aspect and sympathetic aspect in assessing actions. Mill believes that there are two kinds of sanctions for the moral conduct, one external and other internal. Within this school of utilitarianism, there are two major dimensions, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham expounds the theory of act utilitarianism, according to which the overall greatest happiness of the people can be achieved only by evaluating the consequence of each proposed action. If the action creates the greater happiness for the greatest number of people, then it can be regarded as moral. It states that when faced with a choice, we must consider the likely consequence of potential action in that particular case, and from that we chose to do what we believe will generate most overall happiness. This is called case utilitarianism. Now the next one is rule utilitarianism. J.S. Mill is the propounder of rule utilitarianism, which does not focus on discrete actions but proposes that moral justification of an action can be derived by following the rules that would benefit the majority of the people. It states that when faced with a choice, we must look at potential rules of action to determine whether the generalized rules produces more happiness than otherwise. Thus, an action should be carried out if it follows a rule and should be morally followed at all times. For example, the trolley dilemma, it is one of the most popular examples we cite while explaining this theory. The philosophers created the test to offer an alternative to the trolley problem, a dilemma so often used to evaluate utilitarianism that it's become a cliche. In the trolley problem, a train is hurtling down the tracks towards the 5 men stuck in its path. You can pull a lever to move the train onto another set of tracks, but if you do, you'll kill a single man trapped in the train's new path. Your dilemma is, do you kill one to save 5? A utilitarian approach states that whichever action allows the greatest number of people to live would be the moral one. This perspective holds in the commonly referenced related scenario, which asks whether you would push a fat man off a bridge to stop a trolley in its path and block it from running over 5 people. This scenario involves a fat man to eliminate the possibility of self-sacrifice. Your weight wouldn't stop the trolley, but this would. The utilitarian answer is that the moral decision is to sacrifice the heavyweight man because you would still be killing one to save 5. Act utilitarians say that they would push the fat man to save the lives of other 5s, whereas the rule utilitarian would ascribe to the role and not commit murder. Here we see that rule utilitarianism looks like Kant's deontology. So the third branch is known as virtue ethics, which is worthy to discuss in detail. Virtue ethics has its origin in ancient Greece, where it was developed by thinkers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, among others. Very broadly speaking, they approached ethics by asking what traits of character makes one a good person, which stands in stark contrast to the core question asked in modern moral theories: what is the right thing to do? Virtue ethics is thus concerned with what kind of people we should be, what kind of characters we should have, and from that it follows how we should act. Therefore, virtue ethics is an ethical theory that emphasizes an individual's character rather than following a set of rules. Aristotle and other virtue theorists reason that if we can focus on being just good people, just good actions will follow effortlessly. Now let's talk about the function argument. Virtue theory reflects the ancient assumption that humans have a fixed nature, an essence, and that the way we flourish is by adhering to that nature. Aristotle described this in terms of proper functioning. Everything has a function, and a good thing is good to the extent that it fulfills the functions and bad to the extent that it doesn't. For example, the function of a knife is to cut, so a dull knife is a bad knife. Analogously, it indicates that as humans we need to grow, be healthy and fertile, but we're also the rational animal and social animals. So our function also involves using reason and getting along with our pack. This is very similar to Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory, according to which God made us with tools. We need to know what's good. Golden mean is a very important concept which is to be explained now. Having virtue just means doing the right thing at the right time, in the right way, to the right amount, towards the right people, is how Aristotle defined in the Nicomachean Ethics. Although the definition above is vague, Aristotle said that there is no need to be specific because if one is virtuous, one would know what to do all the time. They would know how to handle themselves, get along with others, have a good sense of judgment. They can read a room and they know what's right. And when Aristotle understood virtue as a set of robust character traits that once developed will lead to predictably good behavior. Therefore, virtue is the midpoint between the two extremes which Aristotle called vices. For example, let's talk about the virtue courage. Now, the excess of courage would be recklessness, whereas the deficient of courage would be cowardice. The golden mean position is the virtuous position where the virtue called courage lies, and this sweet spot is known as the golden mean. Virtue lies in our power, and similarly so does vice, because where it is in our power to act, it is also in our power not to act. The ethical scenario, for example, suppose walking home from a movie, you see a person being mugged. What is the courageous action for you to take? Your impulse might be to say that a courageous people would go over to the scene and stop the muggling, because courage means putting yourself in harm's way for a good cause. However, a virtuous person in Aristotelian sense would first take a stock of the situation. If you size up the muggler taking into consideration height, weight, age, stamina, ageability, intelligence, etc., and have a good reason to believe that you could safely intervene, and then that's probably the courageous choice. But if you assess the situation and realize that intervention is likely to mean that both you and the victim will be in danger, then the courageous choice will be not to intervene but to call for help instead. According to Aristotle, courage is the midpoint between the extremes of cowardice and recklessness. Cowardice is deficiency of courage, while recklessness is an excess of courage, and both are bad. Aristotle insisted that it is in fact possible to have too much of a good thing. Therefore, being courageous does not mean rushing headlong into danger. A courageous person will assess the situation, they will know their own abilities, and they will take actions that is right in a particular situation. Part of having courage, he argued, is being able to recognize when, rather than stepping in, you need to find an authority to handle a situation that is too big for you to tackle. Now, Aristotle thought all virtues act like this only. The right action is always the midpoint between two extremes. Likewise, the virtue of honesty means knowing what needs to be said and what need not to be said. It also means knowing how to deliver hard truths gracefully and how to break bad news gently, or to offer criticism in a way that it is constructive rather than soul crushing. Now, when you talk about eudaimonia, which is the central idea of Aristotle's virtue ethics, now let's talk about eudaimonia. But what if one has no desire to be virtuous? According to virtue theory, one should become a virtuous person because if one is, then one can attain the pinnacle of humanity. It allows one to achieve eudaimonia, which means a life well lived, human flourishing. Eudaimonia is avowedly a moralized or value-laden concept of happiness, something like true or real happiness, or the sort of happiness worth seeking or having. It is thereby the sort of concept about which there can be substantial disagreement between people with different views about human life that cannot be resolved by appeal to some external standard on which, despite their different views, the parties to the disagreement occur. A life of eudaimonia is a life of striving. It's life of pushing yourself to your limits and finding success. A eudaimonistic life will be full of happiness, which comes from achieving something really difficult rather than just having it handed to you. But choosing to live a eudaimonistic life means that you are never done improving. You are never to a point where you can just coast. You are constantly setting new goals and working to develop new muscles. Choosing to live life in this way also means you will face disappointments and failures. But it is the satisfaction of knowing that you have accomplished a lot and that you have pushed yourself to be the very best person that you can be. This is morality for Aristotle. It is being the best person you can be, owning your strengths while working on your weaknesses. And for Aristotle, the kind of person you lives like this is the kind of person you will do good things. Now, while concluding this section, ethics and values are at the heart of every human endeavor. With this in mind, the introduction to these terms under the umbrella of ethics gives a gainful insight into the different positions and its justifications. This provides us with knowledge to pursue in-depth and intellectual discipline that studies human character and conduct, whom we ought to be and what we ought to do, also a greater understanding of ethics as a discipline, philosophical perspectives. With the elaborative and descriptive analysis of the same, one can understand how this theory has evolved with the changing paradigm of our thoughts and practices, and to what extent the effort of these different ethical schools have been successful in establishing the dignity of human being and a society aware of rights and wrongs towards others. Now let's see some learning outcomes. This module is meant to discuss the issues related to understanding moral theory, ethics and its different approaches in the actual world to the present problem. It aims at achieving the following outcomes. It brings out the main arguments mentioned by various significant theories and their ethicist thinker. The knowledge of ethics offer an in-depth focus on the interaction between moral practice and ethical theory, allowing you to explore ethical theories in relation to actual practical dilemmas. It deals with the historical development of the ethics, which present how the issue of the rights and liberties of concern has been the focal point in the ethical and moral discourses. This knowledge in area of ethics provides theoretical background in ethics, including important methods and debates in present world. It enables one to understand and deliberate in logical way. The views of different kinds of ethical positions show that there is no one way of looking at this issue, and the several efforts have been made to destroy the archaic way of looking at the people. It will also enable us to understand the implication of legal and political framework for ethical argumentation. This module is research driven and focuses on human dignity and cohesive ethical positions in society. This module has tried to present the philosophical discussion over the issue at hand. This enriches one's knowledge of how philosophy has contributed significantly in this realm. The deontological, consequentialist, utilitarian views throws light on how, by applying various philosophical positions, we can understand and analyze the issue of ethical dilemma, which can be handled better. I hope you must had some learning today. Thank you for being with us.